Welcome to Talk True Crime to Me, the first real episode where I sit on my bedroom floor and drink wine and tell you a little story about true crime, apparently. Let's get to it. Hi, so we're back. People liked the first pilot episode, so we're going strong. We're gonna do another one and see how this one goes. It is a beautiful day in Cleveland, Ohio, meaning it has rained literally since the sun came up, and probably also before that as well. So it's kind of true Cabernet and true crime tradition, and by tradition I mean I've done it once, so this makes it a tradition to do it a second time. Maybe is that how traditions work? I'm not sure. Figure it out as we go, I guess. But I always like to cover, and once again by always I mean once, cover a local Cleveland true crime for my first anything. So my first blog post is about Anthony's soul, which is very dark and down a weird path. But so keeping it in the same flavor of my first episode will be of Cleveland. I kind of had to think of like the good Cleveland true crime. So you've got the missing girl Amy Mahalovic, which happened in Bay Village, which is very, very close to where I live. You've got, which was a great book by James Renner that we read for Cleveland Book Club. You got Sam Shepard in Bay Village as well, the doctor who murdered his wife and trying to make it look like it wasn't, but then it was. And you've got Cleveland judge Robert Steele, who paid to have his wife murdered. There's a whole book about that as well. And then you've even got Ariel Castro and the girls in his basement. That happened in Cleveland. Sweet. But this one has a little more depth to it and is a little more interesting to me personally. So we're gonna talk about the Cleveland torso killer, aka the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. So, I have to credit basically every piece of information I'm sharing with you to the Cleveland Metro Parks. Around Halloween, in the spooky time and Halloween time every single year, I think, they do a tour. So they'll give you a presentation of like the crime scene photos, the background behind it, everything that has to do with the Cleveland torso murder, and then they take you on a bus so you can drive around Cleveland, see where the bodies were located, and like even in some cases get out and like walk around that area. So it's really, really cool. So I got a lot of information from that, and then whatever information I couldn't get from that, I found on the Cleveland Police website, the Cleveland Police Museum website. There's a ton of information on there too. So if crime scene photos are your jam, they're not too graphic on that website, but if that's your jam, the Cleveland Police Museum website, Cleveland Police Museum website. There's a whole bunch of Cleveland crimes, and this one's one of them, and they've got a lot of really good information on there as well. So I'll start this off the same way that the tour guide on Cleveland Metro Parks started it off with us, and we will say no one knows who did it. And can't just repeat that to him several times throughout the journey. We don't know who did it. This has been unsolved for 81 years now, I think, if you do like from the last known murder until now. It's been over 80 years. There's no idea, and if there was a suspect, they're not going to get caught anytime. It's not going to be a magical case like Golden State Killer. Like this is long gone and done. Whoever did this is probably dead by now. So like I said, the Cleveland torso killer is also known as the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, which I have to explain what Kingsbury Run is. So it's so imagine Cleveland in the state of Ohio. There's Cleveland, and then there's southeast of Cleveland, there's kind of an area where the Cuyahoga River swoops through, the one that burned, Cleveland, yeah. So Kingsbury Run used to be a natural tributary into the Cuyahoga River. Well, it's since dried up a long time ago. It got named after the guy who found it, and it's, now it's part of the RTA transit system. It kind of zips through there, but really it's just this overgrown, leafy kind of valley. There's really nothing there now, and I mean, what's left of it, you wouldn't even know it was like you wouldn't even know it was a landmark, honestly, because it's just so indistinguishable from other things. It wasn't even until we drove around that I was like, holy crap, that's considered Kingsbury Run. Like, you don't even know when you're driving past. And I mean, a lot of it, there's like a highway built over part of it now, and a lot of the stuff that was there isn't there anymore because it obviously happened 80 years ago. But that's still interesting. was a really good tour. If you're ever in town or you live in Cleveland, I highly recommend you do it. I had a really good time and I learned a lot. And I saw crime scene photos that I've never seen before, and they were startlingly graphic. It was a really great time. So Kingsbury Run in the 1930s was a considerably rough area. It was like basically one big giant trash heap shantytown. Like there was nothing in there besides like people and trash, and like it wasn't a good spot to be in Cleveland. But it became that way, so a little tidbit of Cleveland history that I find is important to kind of explain where we're going. Cleveland was one of the like first automotive cities. It was hugely predominant. It was it was incredibly prosperous, and it was at one point, especially like in the early days, the nation's 5th biggest city. We were loaded, and now it's the 51st, to put that into perspective. But the Great Depression hit Cleveland hard. Like I said, all of Kingsbury Run was a shanty town. People couldn't afford food anymore. I mean, the Depression hit hard everywhere, but Cleveland also got hit really hard. We were doing really, really well financially, and then, you know, all those laborers lost their jobs, and just the Depression, it didn't go, things were not good in Cleveland. The Depression was akin to LeBron leaving. Oh, I'm just kidding. So we're gonna just take a little trip down a different direction for like half a second. So flashback, it's September 5th, 1934. The weather was probably a lot like it is today, cold, rainy, and poopy outside. We're gonna go to Euclid Beach in the Bracknell area. It's kind of a secluded beach, a lot of like kind of woods around it, at least now. I'm sure it was worse then. A beachgoer finds what they think is a piece of driftwood. It's not driftwood. Upon closer inspection, they realize it's the lower part of the torso and upper thighs of a woman who has been chopped at the knees. They never found the rest of her body. They never were able to identify her. The only thing they had to go from, like they didn't have fingerprints, they didn't have a head. The only thing they could determine was that she had been treated with some type of chemical after she was killed, because her skin was red and kind of leathery, so she was treated with some kind of caustic chemical after she'd been murdered. Yeah, she's been unidentified for 84 years. Like, they've never been able to figure out who she even was, let alone who killed her. And this is important now because most places you'll read, they only account 12 victims to the 12 victims to the Cleveland torso killer. And really, especially even in Cleveland, she's counted as victim number 0 because she was before all the rest of them, but most Clevelanders and most true crime people consider her to be the first victim of the torso killer because of his trademark. And you'll see why later, why people really feel that she was actually his first, just because of the way it was done. And that was the story of the Lady of the Lake. So she's still called that. The best they could determine that she was, that she was a white female somewhere between the ages of 33 and 37. They have no other information on that. They don't know who she is. Okay, flash forward to about a year later. Picture it, we're in the Jackass Hill area of Kingsbury Run, which to my understanding is now right around where 490 hits in Cleveland. You don't know that if you don't know it. That's in my brain where he said it was, but I could be wrong. As the story goes, 2 little teenage boys are causing a ruckus running around on Jackass Hill, and one boy stumbles across the decapitated and emasculated body of some man, meaning he had his head cut off and his arm cut off, and this poor little boy found him, so they go get the police. Luckily, well, I guess not luckily, but luckily this guy had a police record, and they still had his hands, and they found his head a little bit further away from where his body was, so they were able to identify him as 28-year-old Edward Andersey. Now this is going to be rare, so don't get used to these bodies being identified, because they're typically not. Yes, they were able to identify him, but his identification didn't lead to anything. He had been stripped nude except for his socks, washed and cleaned and drained of blood, and his wrist has shown signs of rope burn, meaning somebody probably kept him somewhere for some amount of time before he was killed and brought to Jackass Hill. He'd been killed 2 to 3 days before his body was found, and after police arrived and began searching the area, they found his head. But while looking for the rest of Andersey's body, investigators found a different surprise. Another body, which had also been emasculated and decapitated. Except he'd been dead for a lot longer, talking like 3 to 4 weeks this body had been here, so there was a good degree of chemical decomposition. Thank you. And his body had been treated with a chemical which tinged his skin red and made it look kind of leathery. Huh. Coincidence? I think not. Because he would have been killed about the same exact time as the lady. Nope. Doing that in my brain. That's not right. Shit. I thought it was only a month. That's my bad. Okay, so no. Picture 4 weeks before he got killed. We're all together. We're here. I've tried to make a connection and there wasn't a connection to make. It's fine. It's fine. So yeah. You got Edward Andersey and John Doe number 1. So this is kind of where we're at. So the victims right now are Lady of the Lake, Andrew, Edward Andersey, and then John Doe number 1. So things were quiet until about January 26th, 1936. A poor, unfortunate woman finds 2 half-bushel baskets kind of up against a building. Yeah, a manufacturing business on Central Avenue in Cleveland. She opened the baskets. Inside the baskets were, and I love this phrasing, about half a woman. They're, just about half of one. She was wrapped in newspaper and packed into the 2 half-bushel baskets. And everything else, but not her head, because her head was never found. Everything else was found 10 days later in a vacant lot about 1.5 miles away. So this case was like a little bit different. The killer had waited until rigor mortis had set in before he started severing her limbs, which it seemed from them saying that in the beginning, maybe the cause of death for the first 2 were decapitation. They were cut off, and that's what killed them. I think he had waited. He killed her and then maybe waited to disassemble her to put her in the baskets. I don't know if that'd be easier or more difficult. I have never killed anybody or dismembered them, so I wouldn't know. Luckily, again, fingerprints were able to be used in this case, and people knew her name was Florence Polillo, and she was a waitress, a barmaid, and a sex worker. So she was victim number 3. She had also had a police record, so they were able to identify her via her fingerprints. And don't get used to that anymore, because that was the last one. The rest of these are all unidentified. Okay, so June 5th, 1936, about 5 months later, 2 young boys found the head of a male wrapped in a pair of trousers on East 55th near Kingsbury Run. It was found by where now the Shaker Rapid Transit site is. The next day, police found the rest of him dumped in between New York Central and Nickel Plate tracks in an old freight shed. So the area of Kingsbury Run, Cleveland, so if you think about Cleveland, you think about Terminal Tower. That was called Terminal Tower for a reason. It was the end. Cleveland used to be a huge railroad hub and if you look at old aerial pictures of Cleveland, just railroad tracks upon railroad tracks upon railroad tracks. There's hundreds of them. It's insane to see. So Terminal Tower gets its name because it is Terminal Tower, and it still is Terminal Tower for all the RTA stations and stuff. But so they found his body kind of in the railroad tracks area. So the head and body were about 1,500 feet apart, and there was no blood on the ground or anywhere near the scene at all. The corpse was clean and drained of blood, just like the rest. Death was because of decapitation, so this guy really likes to cut people's heads off. So this one's probably really the Lady of the Lake is crazy, but this guy is actually really crazy because police had fingerprints, they had his head, and this person had 6 very distinct tattoos on their body, and police were having a very difficult time identifying him. So he was a 20 to 30-year-old man, and here are the tattoos. He had on his left calf the character Jigs from a comic strip called Bringing Up Father. The right calf was an anchor under a cupid. His right forearm had the names Helen Paul and a dove. His left forearm had 2 cross flags and the initials WCG with an arrow through a heart. So these tattoos suggested a naval background, because I guess that was big at the time. If you were a sailor, you had a lot of tattoos, think like Sailor Jerry era. So if you go to the veterandoe.com, they have a really interesting website about all unidentified possible veterans, and he's on there. But they made a really, really good point where they were saying it's right after the Great Depression. He's still very young, and a lot of people didn't have jobs. So this person obviously had a steady enough job and he had no means to worry about food, to worry about anything. He must not have had a family or a wife or kids, because how could he afford to get these tattoos if he had other financial responsibilities in a time where people were struggling to buy food? So he had to have obviously been steadily employed. And a lot of people speculate that he probably wasn't a native to Cleveland just because of the tattoos and his possible naval background. He probably showed up to Cleveland. And ironically, the Great Lakes Exposition, which we'll get into that in just a second, and also the Republican National Convention were slated for that year. They were literally going to start 2 to 3 weeks after his body was found. So in Cleveland, things were going pretty okay. In 1936, we kind of recovered from the big Great Depression, and the population was still on the rise. There were a lot of manufacturing jobs. Millionaires Row was, doing really great, and people were flocking to the area. So a lot of this is also because of the Cleveland Expo. So there's a sad note here that the idea of a lot of people have is that guy had showed up to be a laborer for the Cleveland Expo or to do something with the Cleveland Expo. And it's actually kind of sad, because if those were his intentions, he made it there, but just not while he was alive, which we'll start talking about now. So on June 27th, 1936, the Great Lakes Exposition opened its doors. And this literally took months and months of preparation. Basically cities were built, and the walls and everything of Cleveland were power washed to be this huge hub of. They liken this festival, this exposition, to the Chicago World Fair. The amount of work and time and effort and everything that went into this to get ready for this. So picture it, the area now where the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the Science Museum, and the First Energy Stadium, how they're kind of, if you've ever seen Cleveland from the shore, there's a natural bluff, and then all those are kind of a little bit lower. Well, the reason why Cleveland was picked to be Cleveland is because of that natural bluff. We were good against Lake Erie. You couldn't just run onto the beach and get into Cleveland. You had to find a way to go around because of the big bluff there. Well, back in the olden days, people used to huck their trash off the bluff because out of sight, out of mind, and who gives a crap about the environment? They'll just huck it off the side. So when this Great Lakes Exposition got planned, they had to plow down all that trash and pick up what they could, because it was just trash. So realistically, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the First Energy Stadium, and the Science Center are all built on trash. Just smashed down, compacted trash. And I wish I were kidding about that, honestly, but we're not. That's real life. It's trash. So they smashed down all their trash, and they made this incredible over-the-top fair. So it was meant to be a distraction. It was meant to bring people to Cleveland, make Cleveland money, and to be a distraction from all the poopy times that were going on with the Great Depression. So they had what is it called? An aquacade. So there was this big restaurant out on the thing, and you could watch while you ate food. You could watch these swimmers do their thing and dance around, and there was water shows. There was Streets of the World, where you could go down the street that had buildings to look 40 plus different countries, where you could get food and snacks, and think Epcot on crack. That was that section of it, and this was just so over the top. It was huge. The first year brought 4 million people to Cleveland, and it was only supposed to be a one summer thing. They did it again the next year, and they got 7 million people there. 7 million people in Cleveland, Ohio, just for this fucking fair. It's insane. And during that, there was a tent set up by, I'm assuming, the Cleveland police that had a death mask, a tattoo chart, and any identifying information they could get about this tattooed man, because they figured if that many people came through their tent and saw this guy, somebody should be able to identify him. Either, you know, his tattoo artist, who are Helen and Paul? Are they his kids? Are they his parents? Do they know him? Is he from the area? It's just insane that nobody has ever been able to identify him, because they had everything. They had fingerprints, they had his head, they had dental records, they had his tattoos, and like they still don't know who he is, even to this day. And that's just crazy. That's insane. So, they had no luck, obviously, trying to identify this tattooed man, because they still haven't. And with the Cleveland Expo in full swing, another body shows up. So think about it. You're like the mayor of Cleveland. You're like, my city's so great and so awesome and so wonderful. And then you have all these fucking body parts showing up just all over the place, which also leads to why it was so, as I mentioned earlier, Cleveland was a big railroad city. You know how easy it is for a hobo, if you were like a traveler, to like just boop, boop, jump up on trains and then just be gone. Like you didn't even need to have a ticket if you were, you know, worldly enough. You just jump on the back of a train and then off you go. So they didn't know if this was like some transient who was like hopping into Cleveland, murdering, and then hopping back out, or if they didn't know. It was really hard to nail that down. But then also these murders that happened during the Great Lakes Expo, you've got 4 million people in Cleveland that don't live in Cleveland. Any of those people could have been killing anybody, and you would have never known, because they didn't live in Cleveland, and this was the time before like identification wasn't like necessary. So you had no idea who Social Security wasn't even really a thing yet. So you didn't even know who any of these people are, and they're in your city. It could have been anybody. So when people go and they hate about why wasn't this ever solved, I completely understand why this was never solved. It was back in a time where, if you see some of the crime scene photos of this, of like police, there was a couple of police like standing over a body with crowds of people behind them. Those weren't police people or like crime scene investigators. They were just people who were like, nah, there's bodies here, I'm gonna hang out. Like it's insane. These crime scenes could not be kept clean. They could, like, the second anybody heard about anything interesting, they're like, well, there's a body, like, let's go downstairs and like poke at it a little bit. And this is also around the time of like, so here's people's morbid curiosity of the time. When John Dillinger, so flash to a different, I don't even know where he was at the time. I didn't research that crime, I researched this one. Back when John Dillinger got shot, so he got shot in the movie theater, cool. People flocked to his body to take their handkerchiefs out and soak up bits of his blood because they were trying to get like a piece of John Dillinger. Now I get that he was a much different person than like these dead people, and he had a lot more fame to him, but at the same time, that's kind of what we're dealing with here. Like the people who hear about it, like it's like, true crime lovers back in the day. They didn't have a TV, or like most of them couldn't read, so they're like, man, this is cool, like let me. True crime addicts, even in 1936, but they did more damage than they did good, because they compromised basically every crime scene there was. Like, who's to say those little boys who found Edward Anderson didn't, like, poke him around a little bit or, like, huck his head somewhere? I don't know. There's no way to ever know. You'll never know. That's why we're never going to know who did it. And even at the end, you'll see there was some politics that happened. They did have one suspect, and the politics involved around the case, it was never going to get solved. It's always going to be unknown. But I guess in the grand scheme of things, if they can't even identify the victims, obviously their families weren't looking for them. Obviously, we wouldn't know they were, like, you could go on trial for these murders, but you're not, like, going on trial to avenge anybody, because you don't know who you're avenging. You don't know who that person was, so you can't give their families any justice, because you don't know who they belong to. So, I guess it's all around, like, it's an awful thing that happened, but it's such a messed up situation. Okay. So, like I said, sorry for that tangent, on July 22nd, 1936, like I said, we're in the height of the Expo, a fifth body was found by a poor teenage girl. The man was dismembered while alive this time, so that was kind of uncommon. That wasn't the butcher's MO. He usually killed him with decapitation and then dismembered them, but this time he dismembered him while he was still alive, and it made this awful, awful bloody mess. So the body was found in the Big Creek area of Brooklyn, which is a suburb of Cleveland, and it's the only West Side murder. And by West Side, I mean we're talking the difference of like, it's like West 60th, but like South-ish. It's a very specific part of Cleveland, but it's not like Cleveland proper. It's kind of like one of the outer regions of it. He was dead for about 2 months before he was discovered, and there was a pile of bloody clothing nearby as well, which just tells you it was a dry summer if there was still blood on those clothes after 2 months of being exposed to the elements. So flash a little bit further, there's a little bit of a break. September 10th, 1936, a transient trips over the upper half of a human torso while they're trying to catch a train on East 37th Street in the Kingsbury Run area. So only half the torso was found this time, with nothing remaining below the hips. His head was never found, he didn't have any arms, and his body was never identified. And this is one of the ones that you can go and see where the crime scene is. You can literally just see the crime scene being compromised in this picture. I think over 600 people came out to the crime scene. You can't even contain that. You can't even contain that crime scene at that point. With 600 people there to flock, that's insane. Yeah, if you look at this picture, just a bunch of guys jamming sticks in a muddy water while wearing business attire and their socks rolled up. Which, yeah, so this is the one. There's a big open sewer nearby, which was basically, it's you should see the picture of it. It's literally just a big open sewer. Police found the lower half of the man's torso and parts of both legs, and they sent a diver in to look for more. Which, like, at that point, you're going to find a bunch of trash and maybe some more bits, but if you haven't found the main bits, you're not going to find these little tiny bits. So the coroner of the time, he's been the coroner this whole time, Coroner Pierce, noticed that the decapitations became more confident and showed someone who was comfortable with killing as well as the human anatomy. So the head had been cut off in one clean stroke with this body. There was no second, it was just boop, and off it went. Which I think this is around the time that the people kind of called him the butcher, because he was getting good at this, and he was dismembering all his bodies and wrapping them up in meat packaging, and they were like, well, he's obviously got like some kind of field with this. I don't think Cleveland police ever really bought into that too hard, but that was his, like, that's why he's called the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, other than just to play on like somebody who kills people. And it's after victim number 6 is found that all the newspapers get a hold of the stories, realize that it's probably a serial killer about, and the city of Cleveland starts going bananas. They're mad, and they're like, we need somebody to get this together, because there's, I think this is victim number 6, and if you count the Lady of the Lake, victim number 7, they wanted some answers. And this is around the time that we get our wonderfully fresh new safety director, Eliot Ness, involved. So for you, those of you who don't know who Eliot Ness is, he was an American prohibition agent, and he brought down Al Capone in Chicago, Illinois. He was part of the infamous team that he dubbed the Untouchables. So, which sounds way more cool and intense than it is, but Eliot Ness got Al Capone on 22 counts of tax evasion, so he's really just a good paper pusher. He didn't, like, kick down doors and, like, get this guy. He got him on tax evasion. But he's our new safety director. He came to Cleveland in 1934, and December 1935 was hired as a safety director. And when all this kind of nonsense went along, they wanted him to handle the situation. So the search for the Mad Butcher literally leads to the biggest police investigation in Cleveland history. Like, there's never been one bigger than this. It's the biggest one. 2 full-time investigators on the case, which names are Peter Murillo and Martin Zalewski, which I think Peter Murillo's daughter wrote a book, maybe? Sounds right, with a lot of good information on it, and if not, it was his papers or something. Look for the name Murillo and the Butcher if you want to. read that. I'm pretty sure I'm not talking nonsense. Yeah, they interviewed 1,500 people, often going to the seediest parts of Cleveland, dressing undercover where necessary. And if you look online, there's a wonderfully sweet picture of Peter Murillo dressed like a hobo. And I really wish you could just see that. So after seeing the crime scene photos, if you need a little heart warmer, Peter Murillo dressed like a hobo is one of the sweetest things I've ever seen. And also, there's a new election that November. The mayor's still the same, Harold Burton, but Coroner Pierce is given the boot. They wanted someone younger and more democratic. And it's funny because now this guy, his name was Sam Gerber, is apparently now legendary because he testified in another Cleveland case, Sam Shepard, which was the doctor who killed his wife. Killed his wife. That was supposed to be a wank. It looked like shit. Fine. Move on. We're done. We're not done. Okay, so February 23rd, 1937, a man finds the upper half of a woman's torso washed up on shore on Lake Erie in Bracknell on Euclid Beach. Does it feel like you're having deja vu? Because you shouldn't. We literally just had this happen. Jane Doe number 1 was found in the exact same spot Lady of the Lake was found, which is another reason why they think he did it, because how would he not know if there was another, what are the odds of a body washing up on shore in the exact same spot, like 3 years apart from each other? It's kind of not that most plausible of a thing to happen, I guess. So this one's different though, because she wasn't decapitated as a way of death. It was done after the fact. The lower half of her torso washed up about 3 weeks later. She was never identified because she didn't have any hands or head. Kind of hard to identify a body when you don't have hands or a head. So that was February 23rd. On June 6, 1937, Jane Doe number 2 is found. A teenage boy found a human skull under the Lorraine Carnegie Bridge. Next to it were the skeletal remains of a black woman about 40 years old. It appeared she'd been dead about a year, and next to her head was a burlap sack containing her skeletal remains, and she was missing a rib. Jane Doe number 2 is the only African-American victim. There was no other ones, but she was also never identified officially. But dental records, because they did find her head, dental records thought she was Rose Wallace, but they wasn't ever actually determined to be the case. Like, they just had a good hunch that it was supposed to be her. But the possible ID never led to any leads anyway, so it didn't really matter. It didn't really go anywhere. John Doe number 5. So exactly 1 month after possibly Rose Wallace's body is found, another one's found. What is going on here? Microsoft Word, you are the bane of my existence. So I guess there were labor issues in the flats of Cleveland, which I don't know what that means, but there were labor issues in the flats of Cleveland, and because of that, well, I know what the flats of Cleveland means, the flats of Cleveland, but the National Guard had been called in to kind of keep the peace. And sorry, I just had to wet my whistle a little bit there. Okay, we're calming down. We're coming close to the end, honestly. So a young guard saw a piece of victim number 9 floating in the wake of a passing tugboat. Poor young guard. It took a couple days, but police eventually found the whole body, but not the head, because of course they didn't find the head. The abdomen had been gutted and his heart was ripped out, and the victim was in his mid to late 30s and never ID'd, but clearly the damage to the body shows an escalation, like he's getting more enraged while he's killing people. On April 8th, 1938, a young man on his way to work in the flats saw what he thought was a dead fish along the banks of the Cuyahoga River. It's not a dead fish because it's never a dead fish, except when you're in Cleveland, it probably is a dead fish. When he got closer to it, he realized it was the lower half of a woman's leg. In May, police pulled 2 burlap sacks out of the Cuyahoga River, and it contained both parts of the torso and the rest of both legs. So this one's interesting because an autopsy reported drugs in her system. And she was the first victim to ever have drugs in her system. And you know, in the beginning we're like, oh, well, you know, we don't know if she was drugged to, like, subdue her for the attack or if she was a drug addict. And, like, well, we'll wait just until we find her arms. Well, they never found her arms, so they were never able to determine if she was a drug addict or she had been drugged. And they also never found her head, so they never made an identification because she didn't have any hands, she didn't have a head. On August 16th, 1938, scrap collectors foraging in a dump site near East 9th found the torso of a woman wrapped in a man's double-breasted navy blazer and then wrapped in a quilt. The legs and arms, her legs and arms were found in a box wrapped in brown butcher paper and held together with rubber bands. The head was wrapped similarly. While searching for the rest of the woman's body, another body was found, and this was the body of a decapitated male. His head was found in a trash can. Neither victims were ever identified. These bodies were placed in such an area that from Eliot Ness's window of his office, he would have blatantly been able to see them. And he felt this was done intentionally to infuriate him, and it worked. I didn't know this about Eliot Ness, and so I hope you also didn't know this about Eliot Ness, because this is quite an interesting little tidbit of his history. 2 days after those bodies are found, well, actually technically like a night after the bodies are found, on August 18th, 1938 at 12:40 in the morning, Eliot Ness and 35 police officers and detectives raid the hobo jungles of Kingsbury Run. So they go to the shanty towns and they kick down all the doors and they take every human being and dog. The tour guide said all the dogs were sent to the APL, and I like really hope that's true. So they ended up getting 63 men out of the shanty towns, and all their dogs were safe in the APL. I'm gonna believe it because I don't want to believe that those dogs got hurt. They raided them for any evidence that they could find, and they searched and investigated, and when they didn't find anything, they burned the shanty towns to the ground. Every single one. They, like, just lit them up, and all these people had to sit and watch their houses burn. Like, Eliot Ness was just on a next level rage because he'd been getting so much, like, he's been getting so much, like, I don't know the word for this, like, I don't even know, he was just getting so much for it because they hadn't solved it yet. And these murders have been going on for 4 years now, you know, and he was infuriated because it's almost like this person's mocking him at this point. And, you know, the good news about this, though, is from what I understand, too, though, they use this as a way to make everybody had to get Social Security cards before they could, like, go back and do whatever. They all got arrested and got fingerprinted and ID'd, and then they got released if they didn't have any evidence for them, because none of them had IDs and none of them had been fingerprinted. So his idea was that it was happening in Kingsbury Run, so this person must live in Kingsbury Run and know these people enough to get them. But how would somebody let me take you back to my shanty house, murder you while these walls are literally made out of, like, cardboard? It doesn't seem like it would work. I don't think that's, like, a feasible, you would yell, I'm assuming, and, like, maybe, I don't know. So he got a lot of flack for that, a lot of criticism, because he'd done such a drastic thing, but there weren't any murders after that. So I guess he got what he wanted. I guess it worked. Over the course of 1934, so the discovery of Lady of the Lake, and up until people suspect 1950, there were like 10 murders that happened between Cleveland, Youngstown, and Pittsburgh, the, like, triangle of area where bodies would find up and just torsos. And not very many people attribute those to the torso killer. Some do, some don't. Most people disagree on the 12 or 13 victims that we know were most likely him. There's also a rumor that the Cleveland torso killer is also the person who killed Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia murder, but I don't know if I believe that to be true. There's nothing to prove that. So we'll finish up really quickly with the suspects. So these are pretty interesting. There's a man named Frank Dolezal, who's 52 years old. He was arrested as a suspect in Flo Palillo's murder, but he died under suspicious circumstances in jail, so they were never able to try to convict him. Then, secondly, the best one of them all, which has the politics, is Dr. Francis E. Sweeney. He's a veteran of World War I, part of the medical unit who performed amputations, so he'd know what he was doing. Eliot Ness personally interviewed him during his police interview, and Sweeney failed to pass 2 early polygraph tests, so technically he lied and he was failing it. Ness never went on with it, though, because he felt he didn't have enough for conviction, and also Dr. Francis Sweeney's brother was also Eliot Ness's political opponent, so he wanted to keep his seat, so he didn't, he kind of kept quiet for political reasons. And it's especially funny because Congressman Martin L. Sweeney, which was Dr. Sweeney's brother, or first cousin, he was the one who was constantly hounding Ness for an arrest. So imagine how easily that would get shot down. They're like, oh, well, you just arrested my cousin because I've been giving you a hard time. So it was a nasty situation, and it was never gonna come to fruition for anybody. This case is over 80 years old and still completely unsolved. And honestly, I don't think it'll ever get solved. That's just how I feel it'll be. So, yeah, that's it. That's all I have for the Cleveland Torso Killer. That's kind of the last of it. If you don't follow Cabernet and True Crime on Instagram, I suggest you do. I'm going to try to do these every week, but we'll see if that actually happens or not, because I usually cut it quite to the wire. It is Monday. It happens. It'll get done. I hope you like this. Tell me what I can do better, what I can do different. I'm still working on getting a different camera lighting situation, because sitting on my floor is, well, comfortable. Kind of lame. Okay, well, cheers and happy True Crime Tuesday.